The latch held. That was the first thing Caleb Wren noticed. Before the cold, before the dark, before the long groan of the wind above him. The iron latch on the inner door held without shivering, and the small dry click it made when he tested it sounded like a coin dropped onto a wooden table in a quiet room. Outside, the thermometer his neighbor had left him as a joke had stopped registering at 40 below an hour ago. The mercury had pulled itself down into the bulb and refused to come out. Inside, where Caleb stood in his shirt sleeves with a tin cup of coffee cooling at a normal speed, the air was the temperature of an early October morning. He set the cup on the shelf. He listened to the latch. He waited. 6 weeks earlier, Caleb Wren had stood at the edge of a frozen meadow 7 miles south of Buffalo Crossing, Wyoming territory, with nothing but a borrowed shovel and an idea that every man in the county called a fool's errand. He was 41 years old that autumn of 1887. He had come west from Pennsylvania 11 years before, with a dead wife's wedding ring sewn into the lining of his coat and a stubbornness that had outlasted most of his teeth. He had a quarter section of land that nobody else had wanted because the creek ran shallow and the wind came down off the bighorns without anything to break it. He had a sorrel mare named June. He had 40 empty oak barrels he had bought, one at a time, from a failing cooper in Casper, hauling them home 2 at a time in the back of a wagon over the course of a summer. And he had a single sheet of paper, folded 4 times, on which an old Shoshone man named Tavi had drawn him a diagram with the charred end of a stick. The diagram showed a hole in the ground. People in Buffalo Crossing had stopped asking what the barrels were for by the 3rd trip. By the 5th, they had started laughing. By the 8th, Reverend Hollis had taken Caleb aside outside the feed store and spoken to him the way a man speaks to a horse that has begun favoring its left foreleg. "Caleb," the Reverend said in the gentle voice he used at funerals, "a man your age oughtn't be digging in October. There's a boarding house in Sheridan keeps a warm room through the winter. My sister's husband knows the proprietor." Caleb had thanked him and gone on loading barrels. The harder cut came 2 days later from Wilkes Renfrew, who had grown up on the next farm over, and who was the closest thing Caleb had to appear in the valley. Wilkes was 38, broad in the shoulder, easy in the laugh, and he had a way of saying cruel things without any heat behind them, the way some men whistle without knowing they're doing it. He found Caleb out by the meadow with the shovel in his hands and the first trench already cut. "Wren," Wilkes said, hands in his coat pockets, breath steaming. "I'm not going to laugh at you. I want you to know that." Caleb kept digging. "I just feel sorry for you, is what it is," Wilkes went on. "A man loses a wife, I understand it. A man gets to a certain age out here alone. I understand that too. But 40 barrels, Caleb. 40. In a hole. You hear what that sounds like when I say it back to you." Caleb lifted another shovelful of dirt and set it on the growing mound beside the trench. "My door's open if it gets bad," Wilkes said. "Yours won't be a door at all. It'll be a lid." He walked away. He was not unkind. That was the worst of it. The trench Caleb was digging that afternoon was not, in fact, where the barrels would go. The barrels would go deeper, in a chamber he had already started 2 weeks before, dug into the south slope of a low rise that caught the morning sun and shed the worst of the prevailing wind. The trench he was working on now was a side passage, what Tavi had called, in his halting English, the breath of the room. Caleb had not understood it the first time. He had not understood it the 3rd time. He had drawn it again on his own paper at night by the light of a single candle, and on the 4th night the shape of the thing had come clear to him the way a word you have been hunting all day arrives at the moment you stop hunting it. The breath of the room was a curve of dead air. Tavi had explained it to him in the back of a livery stable in Lander the previous spring. The old man had been waiting out a rain. Caleb had been waiting for a farrier. They had shared a piece of dried meat and 3 hours of silence broken by perhaps 40 sentences. Tavi had said that his people, before the reservations, had kept winter stores in pits lined with bark and packed with dry grass, and that the pits had stayed cool in summer and above freezing in winter, even when the wind on the open plain killed buffalo in their tracks. He had said that the secret was not the dirt. The dirt was only the blanket. The secret was the shape of the empty space inside the blanket, a space arranged so that the warm air the earth gave off could pool, and the cold air that crept in around the door could fall away into a lower channel and never reach the stored goods. A space, Tavi had said, that breathed slowly, the way an old animal breathes in its sleep. Caleb had asked the old man how deep. Tavi had looked at him a long time before answering. Deeper than a grave, he had said, or it does not work. Caleb had remembered that. He dug for 3 weeks. He dug through the first frost and through the second. He dug until his hands cracked and bled inside his gloves, and the cracks froze open and bled again. The chamber he carved out of the south slope was 12 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 9 feet deep at its deepest point, with a sloped floor that fell away 2 inches every foot toward the back wall. Off the main chamber, on the downwind side, he dug the side passage Tavi had drawn, a curving channel 4 feet long that doubled back on itself before opening into the main room. He lined the channel with flat stones he hauled from the creek bed, one at a time, in a sling on his back. The stones were the second thing the town laughed at. Wilkes Renfrew came by on the day. Caleb was setting the last of them and stood watching for a long time before he spoke. "Stones in a dirt hole," Wilkes said. "Wren, I have to ask. Did somebody hit you in the head this summer and not tell me?" "The stones," Tavi had said, "would hold the day's small warmth and give it back through the night. The dirt would hold the season's larger warmth and give it back through the winter. The barrels," and here was the part no one in Buffalo Crossing had bothered to find out, because no one had bothered to ask. The barrels were not for storage. They were for the walls. Caleb set the 40 oak barrels into the chamber across 4 days in the last week of October. He set them on their sides in 2 staggered rows along the long walls of the room, 20 barrels per side, ends pointing inward. He had knocked out the inner heads of each barrel the week before, leaving the outer head intact. The hollow of each barrel he packed tight with dry prairie grass he had cut and cured all August, mixed with wood ash from his own stove and a layer of crumbled bark from a dead cottonwood. When the barrels were packed, he stood the staves into the earthen wall behind them so that the curved outer head of each barrel faced the room. From inside, the wall looked like a long bench of dark wooden circles. From behind, in the dirt, each barrel was a sealed pocket of dead air, 3 layers deep, wood, then ash grass bark, then more wood, pressed against the cold earth, and yet separated from it by the most efficient insulator any man on the high plains had ever found, and most men had never bothered to name. Dead air does not move. Dead air does not carry heat away. A wall of 40 sealed dead air pockets, set behind another 2 feet of packed earth, will hold the temperature of a small fire for a long time, and will hold the temperature of a man's body for longer than a man would believe, if he had not done it himself. Caleb did not know the physics by that name. He knew it the way a man knows the weight of his own axe. He finished the roof on the 3rd day of November. He laid peeled lodgepole pine across the chamber, then a course of bark, then 18 inches of dry sod, then another foot of loose dirt, piled into a low mound that from any distance looked like nothing more than a swelling of the prairie. The chimney he ran up through the back corner, double-walled in tin he had cut from a busted lantern hood, with a small iron damper he could close from inside. The door was set into the side passage at the bend, so that when it opened, the cold air rushing in had to turn a corner and fall before it could reach the room. Tavi's breath of the room, the curve that made the cold lie down. The first storm came on the night of November the 17th. It came without much warning, the way the bad ones do. A high thin cloud at noon, a smell like wet iron by 3 o'clock, and by sundown a wind that took the top off a haystack on the Renfrew place and threw it half a mile into a draw. The temperature fell from 20 degrees above zero to 10 below in the space of 4 hours. By midnight it was 25 below. By the second night it was 38 below and still falling. Caleb was inside his earth room by the time the wind reached its full voice. He had brought June into the side passage, which was wide enough for the mare to stand and turn, and he had stacked feed for her against the stone wall. He had brought a small iron stove which he lit once a day for an hour and no more. He had brought lamp oil, salt pork, dried beans, a sack of cornmeal, 2 wool blankets, a book of psalms he did not read, and his dead wife's wedding ring, which he kept in a tin box on the shelf above the stove. He had also brought, on the morning of the storm, the 8-year-old daughter of his nearest neighbor to the east, a man named Peterson, whose wife had died of fever in August and who had ridden out 3 days before to fetch a doctor from Sheridan and had not yet come back. The girl was named Ada. She had a cough that rattled in her chest like a loose nail in a tin cup, and a fever that came and went in waves, and she had been alone in the Peterson cabin with a dying fire when Caleb found her. He had not planned for a child. On the second night of the storm, with Ada wrapped in both wool blankets on the cot against the back wall, and June breathing slow in the side passage, and the wind above making a sound like a train that would not arrive. Caleb heard something he could not place. It was a low groan from somewhere beneath the floor. He sat up on the stool by the stove. He held his breath. He heard it again, a long, slow, subaudible complaint, as if the earth itself were settling its weight onto something that did not want to bear it. He did not know yet whether it was the chamber settling under the load of snow above, or one of the lodgepoles in the roof beginning to give, or something in the side passage where June stood, or whether it was nothing at all, and his own ears were inventing weight where there was none. He sat very still on the stool and he listened. The latch on the inner door held. In the morning, if morning was the word for the gray hour, when the chimney damper let in a thin gruel of light, Caleb found the source of the sound. A seam of frost had formed along the joint where the side passage met the main chamber, and the wood of one of the lodge poles had contracted in the deep cold and pulled itself a quarter-inch away from the stone. The groan had been the wood letting go of the stone. Nothing had failed. The room was still warm. The mare was still standing. The girl was still breathing, shallow and quick, on the cot. He banked the stove. He checked the damper. He sat down beside the cot and put his hand on Ada's forehead and felt the fever climbing. He had prepared for cold. He had not prepared for a sick child. He boiled water on the stove and steeped a handful of dried yarrow that he had hung from a roof beam in September, because his wife had hung yarrow in their kitchen in Pennsylvania, and he had never broken the habit. He fed the girl the tea a spoonful at a time. He laid a cool cloth on her brow when the fever climbed and a warm one when she began to shiver. He spoke to her only twice, both times to ask if she could drink. She nodded both times. He did not speak otherwise. There was no one else to speak to, and the silence of the room was part of how the room worked. On the 4th day of the storm, the thermometer outside stopped at 40 below. On the 5th day, Caleb opened the inner door to check the side passage and found June asleep on her feet with frost on her muzzle and her body still warm to the touch. And behind her, at the outer door, a wedge of snow had been pressed against the wood by the wind to a depth of perhaps 11 feet. The outer door would not open. He had known it would not. He had built it to open inward for exactly that reason. He shut the inner door and went back to the girl. On the 6th day, Ada's fever broke. On the 7th day, the wind dropped. On the 8th day, Caleb heard, faintly, the sound of voices above the chamber. He climbed up through the side passage and pushed open the outer door against the softened snow and stepped out into a white country he barely recognized. The drifts were taller than his cabin, which still stood, miraculously, 50 yards to the north. The chimney of the Peterson place was not visible. The Renfrew farm, half a mile west, showed only the peak of the barn roof. Wilkes Renfrew was standing at the edge of Caleb's meadow with 3 other men and a pair of mules, and the look on his face was not a look Caleb had seen on him before. "Wren," Wilkes said. Caleb waited. "We lost the bunkhouse," Wilkes said. "Roof come down on the 2nd night. We been in the root cellar 4 days. Carruthers lost his barn and most of what was in it. Peterson never made it to Sheridan. They found his horse standing dead on the road 3 miles out. We don't know about Peterson yet." Caleb nodded once. "His girl," Wilkes said. "She's inside," Caleb said. It was the 3rd sentence he had spoken aloud in 8 days. Wilkes looked past Caleb at the low mound in the meadow, at the thin line of smoke rising from the tin chimney, at the door set sideways into the earth. He did not speak for a long time. The other men did not speak either. One of them, an older man Caleb did not know well, took off his hat, though the cold should have kept it on. Caleb stepped aside from the door. The 4 men came down through the side passage one at a time, ducking under the lintel, turning the corner where the cold air fell, and emerging into a room that was the temperature of an early October morning. Ada was sitting up on the cot, eating a bowl of cornmeal with molasses, and June was drowsing in the passage behind her, and the small iron stove was unlit because the room had not needed it since dawn. The wedding ring was on the shelf. The book of Psalms was on the shelf. The 40 oak barrels lined the long walls like the heads of 40 old soldiers standing at rest. And behind each one, in the dark of the dirt, a sealed pocket of dead air did the quiet work it had been doing for 9 days. No one said anything for a long while. Wilkes Renfrew sat down on the floor with his back against one of the barrels. He took his gloves off slowly. He held his bare hands toward the cold stove out of habit, then realized he didn't need to, and lowered them into his lap. He looked at the barrel beside him, at the curve of its outer head, at the way the wood had darkened with age and earth. He put his hand flat against it. He held it there. The strongest walls are rarely the ones built to impress. If this story stayed with you, the next one is already waiting by the fire.